Welcome to the special elections edition of 2 Half Hours. Every week we get beyond all the election hype, break through the spin, and jump right into the discussion on the issues that matter most to you. With Newt Gingrich dropping out, Mitt Romney faces only Ron Paul. But who will get Ron Paul's vote in the general election? France and Greece are facing major elections. What will America do if it loses more allies in Europe? President Obama drew fire for stressing flexibility in U.S.-Russia relations. What does the return of Vladimir Putin mean for American foreign policy, particularly in Syria? Human rights are in the news in China. Will tensions over dissidents become an issue in the 2012 campaign? Speaking of human rights, Bahrain's democracy movement has denounced constitutional reforms as a fig leaf. Will President Obama finally speak out? With the two major party candidates seeming to go against desires of many of their supporters, is this the year a third party breaks through? Joining us here as we survey the election terrain, we have with us today Mr. Peter Wallison of the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Randy Short of Dignity, Mr. Diallo Brooks of People for the American Way, and Mr. Bruce Malashevitz from the Economic Consulting Services. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And so we want to jump right in, and I want to start with you here, Mr. Wallison. One thing we're seeing in the economic debate and how it's unfolding in the presidential election is really over the issue of tax policy. And on the one hand, you have Mitt Romney and the Republicans saying, well, we need to cut taxes to spur growth, and President Obama saying we need to raise taxes on the wealthy in order to decrease inequality, which he claims will also spur growth. You know, what camp do you generally fall in or feel is more correct?
I'm in the tax cut group. In fact, I was in the Reagan administration, and after the recession that occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Reagan cut taxes. We had a very strong recovery, much stronger than the one we're having now. And I think the reason for that is that we left much more money in the hands of people who could create jobs and invest, and gave them a lot more certainty about the future. Today, most business people in the United States really have no idea what their costs are going to be in the future. Healthcare, financial regulation is another really big problem. Those are two areas where people have very grave doubts and don't want to make investments until they have some kind of certainty. So the way to actually address this issue, I think, would be to cut taxes rather than to say we're going to tax more and spend more in order to produce prosperity. That has not obviously worked over the last 3 years.
Dr. Short, how do you feel about that? Could cutting taxes spur growth?
No, we're polar opposites. I think that the tax rate is too low. In fact, I think it contributes to a lot of social discord because you have a group that has the majority of the money, that top 10%, and the more they get, the less there's concern for the rest of society. I think that the tax rate should be increased almost to the 1950 era. Those were happy days before. I think we could have happy days again. I think that the repeal of Glass-Steagall has been a great contributing factor to the bubble and the so-called recession that I consider depression that we have now. So reining in the gilded lords has always been good for the average people. Some people need to spend their own money. Some people could start their own jobs or start their own businesses if they were paid enough. Things like raising the minimum wage, where you can have a working middle class. The middle class is suffering, and it seems as if the more that goes to the top, the worse things seem to get for the bottom 90 or 85% of the American population.
I appreciate that, Dr. Short. Now, Mr. Brooks, Dr. Short mentioned the 1950s rates, which I believe inched up over 80%, perhaps, if I'm wrong. What do you think about this? Is that too high? Should we be focusing on cutting taxes, encouraging more growth?
Well, I mean, I think we should be really focusing on what's going to be the best for the American people, what's going to get us the results that we need as far as prosperity for everyone in this country. And I think, as was mentioned before, there's a lot of emphasis on prosperity for the top 10% and actually even the top 1% in this country. And I think there's a time where we're in times where more of our population needs to take more of sacrifice for the well-being of this country. And I think that the bottom 90% has taken on that sacrifice many times over the years. And it's time for also those that have the most to be able to contribute to help this country to continue to prosper.
Mr. Malashevitz, now you work very closely in many ranges of the economic field. How do you feel about this issue?
Well, on the issue of taxes, I think the debate is to some extent misdirected because the denominator should be the share of total taxes paid by, pick a number, top 5%, 10%. But if I remember correctly, the top 10% pays 80% of all income taxes paid into the government. So I resent a bit the notion of the propaganda about the top 10% not paying their share of taxes. I mean, do you want them to pay 100%? Do you want the entire country to be directed by 10% of the population? I don't think so. I'm very much in favor of a flat tax, no deductions, and revenue neutral. But we do have to pay down the debt. And I think every working American, whether it's $1 or $100,000, needs to contribute.
Well, I want to follow up with you really quickly on that, though, because, you know, we see the income tax thing put forward, but when I saw from the Brookings Institution this morning that when you add in income taxes and payroll taxes, about 78% of Americans are paying taxes. So it seems as if the tax burden is spread relatively fairly already.
Well, like I said, the income tax is what drives the economy and the government. And yes, there are these other taxes, certainly. But the reality is that a very small minority accounts for 80% of the revenue taken in by the government by income tax. So I don't think that constitutes less than a fair share of the total.
Fair enough. So please.
I think the point about the debt that Mr. Malashevitz made is very, very important. We are on the way to a cliff in which the capital markets are going to tell us that we've got to get hold of our debt, and they're going to tell us in a very mean way. That is to say, they're going to stop buying U.S. government securities unless we increase the interest rate on those securities substantially. Now, the only way that we can meet these obligations, we cannot meet them by increasing taxes. As the suggestion was made by Mr. Malashevitz, we have already taxed the people who are capable of paying high taxes very substantially. They're already not producing the jobs that we want. But in order to deal with the debt problem, we have to cut our spending very substantially, and that's not something that this country has focused on in the past. We've got to devote ourselves to doing that over the next few years.
Well, Mr. Brooks, what about that? I mean, you say we should do what's best for the American people. I mean, it seems like, well, some would argue that perhaps doing what's best for the capital markets is the opposite. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, if we have to look at this in a total context. I mean, it's about dealing with the debt, but it's also about dealing with job creation in this country. And as and a lot of business owners would tell you, and I've had personal conversations with some and say that they don't make any decisions about hiring based on taxes. They make their decisions about hiring before they even have any conversations about taxes. So taxes doesn't weigh into whether they're going to hire or fire or increase or build out their particular company. So if that's the case, then I think that we need to take that particular argument off the table and look at the total picture and figure out where can we increase revenue. We have deficit issues. There's been cut after cut after cut on the social services side, for many of us in this country. So there's a need to actually look at those that actually have the revenue to contribute back to this economy. Most businesses in this country function in a society where they're given that opportunity because they're in America. So there is a certain level of debt in which they owe to this country in order to continue to be able to have a prosperous country and a country where they can actually function as a business in this way. They don't have that opportunity in many other places in the country.
Let me ask you a question, since we're allowed to ask questions, and that is, if you taxed 100% of profits, do you think anyone would be hired?
I'm sure.
Really? There wouldn't be any businesses. There would be no point in having a business. I mean, the reason people are hired is because some people profit from starting a business. So if you say the taxes are irrelevant to hiring people, taxes are very important to hiring people. What you actually get out of your business is the reason why you have a business.
So you say that most people that have a business make decisions about hiring based on the amount of taxes that they
No,
pay?
based on the profit that they can take back from the business. And if you increase their tax, or you increase their costs in various areas, their electrical costs, their steel costs, their other costs, whatever you want to talk about, all those costs are things
Minus
they
all
have
the
to take.
minus all their deductions.
Wait a minute, I'm just talking about the cost of doing business. Doing business. Then we get to the tax, because after they account for all their costs, they have some profit left. Then the tax man comes along. And if you're saying that it doesn't matter how much tax is imposed on these people, that can't be right, because if you taxed it all, they would go home. There wouldn't be any point in having a business. So you can't.
But you're also not calculating in the numerous deductions that they get. Company, for example, GE,
Can I throw something on
Definitely.
the floor? One of the things I want to throw on the floor is, with the cut in taxes, we've watched the industrial base of this country be exported. So I see the taxes being cut and the people not having to give that to the tax man, but they invest in the speculative economy like derivatives, which is going to blow up in our face one day. But you send the base overseas and you say, don't tax me because I'm going to create jobs. But we're thinking it's here, and it ends up being China or the Philippines or Mexico. That's a bait and switch. And my question for you is, do all corporations pay taxes? Because my understanding is some don't, but maybe you know something I don't know.
Well, on the face of it, the United States is the highest corporate tax country in the world today. Japan recently cut their taxes so that we now are at the very top. And that's the reason why many jobs are going abroad, because it is possible to profit more from building in other countries where you're not taxed as much. You have the problem then of how you repatriate that money. But your profits are higher in other countries because the taxes aren't as high.
But what about the jobs that are being created in prison? It seems as if these same corporations that won't pay a middle-class worker with no criminal record a job finds it tremendously fascinating to invest in the prison industrial complex. So I almost have this sense, if we're going to give money to fellow Americans who get a good wage, we're not interested. But if it's 65 cents an hour, oh, we love it.
Mr. Malisevic, I see you want to get in here.
Yes, well, I just wanted to bring to bear, and the reasoning for the flat tax is because the debate is all being framed on the basis of the taxes, the tax rates as they are in the schedules. Hardly anyone pays those rates. I will confess, and I respect your view, Doctor, about restoring rates from the 1950s and 60s. Now, I was born in the 50s, but I should tell you, in the 70s, the top rate was still about 70%. And I'll confess, I was in that top rate. But my effective tax rate, after all deductions, was 11%. And it was the Reagan reforms that were characterized as a giveaway to the rich that eliminated a lot of the deductions while lowering the bracket rate. And the taxes I paid to the federal government tripled in absolute terms. So I have a respectful objection to those who say, let's restore the rates that applied in the 50s and the 60s, because nobody in their right mind ever paid them.
Well, I want to come to you here, Mr. Walson, because you were there in the Reagan administration, in the Treasury Department when this was going on. What about this idea of a flat tax and taxes actually going up under Ronald Reagan?
That is, the revenues went up under Ronald Reagan, not the actual tax rates. But I would like a flat tax. I just don't think that politically it is feasible right now in the United States. I mean, I think it would be a good idea to remove a lot of the steps, maybe have 2, maybe 3 steps. But it's very hard for me to see, it always has been hard for me to see how a person who is earning a lot might pay exactly the same amount in necessary, the percentage of his taxes, her taxes, to someone who is earning very little. And that's what I take it a flat tax would do. I see the advantages to the economy. I think it would be terrific for the economy. But I just don't think politically it's something that's feasible.
Well, Mr. Brooks, let me go to you here. We saw in the unemployment numbers a sort of a downtrend in unemployment, but as I was reading in many papers this morning, it was primarily because people dropped out of looking for work. They were so discouraged. And so the question I have for you is are we seeing with this, whether we want to call it a recovery or not, I'll leave up to you gentlemen to decide, something of a high unemployment, low-wage economy growing in this country?
I mean, I think that you've answered your question. Yes, there is. There's a continual struggle with employment in this country, and particularly in communities of color. It's even higher than the national average. We still have low-wage jobs that are available for folks. So basically people that were employed, if they're getting jobs at a lower wage than they had before. So that's affecting their families, their ability, whether it's ability to raise the capital to start small businesses, things of that nature. So yeah, there is a struggle. It continues to be a struggle. It was a struggle in the previous administration. There's a struggle under the current administration. And I think that there needs to be work in this country to help restore good, high-paying jobs, also dealing with the issues of education, making sure that the population is educated to the job levels that are necessary to drive this economy, and making sure that people have a stake in that and they don't feel lost in this current economic environment.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Short, because you mentioned, restoring tax rates very high. I mean, what responsibility do corporations really have to raise the level of wages or employ a certain number of people if their primary goal is to make profit?
Well, there often is a lack of discussion that a large number of corporations, in some ways, get money out of the public chest. You get some support, whether it's the roads or the sewers or things to maintain. So it seems as if there should be something that's given back. One thing that makes the country strong is to have people who earn enough money to care about the society, to raise stable families. Otherwise, if the corporations shouldn't do anything, then you'll get a situation like, say, a third world country where the feces and urine run down the street, and just a few blocks over, these palatial places that people live where you have a tale of two cities. And I think some people wouldn't mind that in the United States. There's a certain, and we've had that when you had slavery in the South and you had Jim Crow and you had mill towns. So I think there should be, I was in Cicero, Chicago. The Gillette company practiced what was called paternal capitalism. And their idea was, if you work for Gillette and you're a good worker, you've got somewhere to stay, your schools are going to be good, your community is going to be clean, we expect you to work hard and for us to make a profit off of your work, but this is what you're going to get. I don't always think that all the corporations feel there's a sense of partnership between those people that do the work and those people at the top who have a different level of pay and their shareholders and so forth. There needs to be a partnership, a sense of us working together versus you guys are sort of the peons down there and we're up in the hacienda drinking mint juleps.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Malashevich, because you certainly have worked with, all sorts of major corporations in this country and abroad. I mean, what do you think about this idea? I mean, what do corporations really owe workers in terms of wages and levels of employment?
Well, I agree with the good doctor in the sense there has to be a unity of purpose fashioned in some way. In our small company, we have 25 people, and we try to accomplish that by having a casual atmosphere, first name basis. If somebody has a baby, we give them a special gift. If they get married, give them a special gift. And I think it's a mutual. It's every company has a different culture, but I think it's a way of bonding. Now, it's much easier to do that at my company with 25 people than if you're employing 300,000. But still, there is a means for doing that. The company concerned has to figure out the best path.
Well, Mr. Wallison, let me ask you about this. I mean, isn't the goal of capitalism to, make profit? I mean, to what extent should corporations really care at all about any of this issue of unemployment wages?
Well, it turns out that if you allow profit to be made, there's a lot of prosperity that occurs. We were talking before about the 1950s. I grew up in the 1950s. The 80s, 90s, and 2000s were far more prosperous than the 1950s. And the reason that this country increased the condition of everyone in the country during this period was because some companies were permitted to earn profits. We went through about 10,000 years as human beings in which most people lived a subsistence living. They just eked out whatever they could on the land. About 250 years ago, capitalism developed in England. And since that time, we have had the kind of life that we have today. That is, we have had constant growth, constant improvement in people's circumstances. Most people in this country have almost everyone has an iPhone or some other kind of some other kind of cell phone.
Sure.
Families have two or three
Dr.
televisions. Families have more than one car. I mean, these are remarkable things that come from a profit-making kind of society where we don't think about what corporations produce for people, but what, in fact, people are paid for doing productive work.
Dr. Short, I see you smiling there. You want to get in?
Yes. I think that the Industrial Revolution, this is all has occurred within the last 300 years, but it has its parallels. We have the genocide of the Indians. We have the mass enslavement of people from Africa. We have the opium wars of the Chinese. We have the massive starvation in India for the British East India Company. We've had a whole lot of atrocities. We've had world wars. We've had more conflict as human beings in the last 250 years along with this system. In particular, if we look at the House of Rothschild and some of the others where they make their money in investing in wars between different royal families in Europe, we've had a whole lot of death and suffering to parallel this prosperity that you're referring to. And within that prosperity, we have to remember that people and other places in the world that are subsisting on $1 a day, who in some ways are subsidizing, because if you can get gold or oil or tin or coltan or whatever for almost nothing from the people there and it comes here, our prosperity is subsidized by a tremendous amount of suffering. And there's got to be a reset. It will come one way or the other. And you were mentioning that this debt, the Chinese and the others may not buy our securities, or these countries in Africa that subsidize France, where France rips off its former colonies and they get so many billions of dollars and they don't let the people have. There's a whole lot that doesn't just work smoothly. So
well, let me ask you this: if you a reset, I mean, a reset's out of. I mean, are you saying that we need to eliminate capitalism?
I didn't say that, but what if it eliminates itself? It's the same way you had communism writ large in the Soviet Union. Those things are gone. Now you've got billionaires. You can go to Moscow and it's like Rodeo Drive, depending on where you go. Sometimes systems come to a point where they rise, usually about 200, 300, 400 years, and then there's a change. We might reach a point where this does not sustain itself. There are contradictions in the accumulation of capital that can happen. That could be what's happening, even if we don't know or don't completely understand, because I don't think humanity's ever come to this point before to say, wow, we've had all of this, all these tremendous advances, and ooh, the environment's seeming a little crazy, or the fighting over here, or the Muslims have gone crazy, everybody's fighting and whatever. Where are we? And I don't think that we necessarily know, but it's very important to try to think of what ways we can address human needs, where we can reduce conflict between classes, nations, and religions in order to make some sense of how we proceed as human beings.
Well, what about that, Mr. Brooks? I mean, does economic prosperity in America depend to a certain degree on taming capitalism?
Well, I mean, capitalism is a beast of the people. I mean, as the way our government is set up, the people have the right to control what kind of entity operates within its borders. And just like any corporation, a corporation is an entity of the people of that particular state. I mean, it's chartered by the state. So there always has to be some rules in which capitalism has to operate under, which corporations have to operate under. I'm not against profit. I mean, let me just be clear. And personally, whether my organization aside, personally, I'm not against profit. But I do believe that the American people should have the voice in how that profit impacts communities, how it impacts our interaction with each other, how that impacts our ability to function as a country and prosper together. I mean, there are people with 2 cars. I know a lot of people that don't have a car at all. So when we talk about, there is this disparity that exists within our country. Everybody doesn't have iPhones. There are a lot of people that don't have internet access in our country. So there are some disparities that exist. And so what I'd like to see is us really function as a country where and even within the companies, there are companies that make a lot of money and there are companies that are struggling because of the inequities that exist within capitalism. Some don't play by the same rules that everybody else plays by. So it's really balancing that out, figuring out a way that works for everyone so we can all share in the prosperity, share in the opportunities that this country uniquely is able to provide.
There's something I want to say, and it's a dirty word, but I'm not going to shy away from it. Labor unions. Franklin Roosevelt, I know many people don't like him, but Franklin Roosevelt introduced a lot of socialistic things, some of them great, some of them band-aids, some of them work. Certain things that are socialistic that you see in Europe and societies that are doing a little better around healthcare and everything else, it works there.
We have to go to a break here real quickly here, Dr. Short, but we're going to come right back on the special election edition of 2 Half Hours and talk a little bit about foreign policy in the American elections. All right, so we're back here in the special election edition of 2 Half Hours, and we want to talk a little bit about foreign policy and its relationship to the American electoral process. Now, Mr. Malashevich, I want to bring something up to you because we saw just yesterday that a Russian general had actually threatened a preemptive strike on American missile defense or quote-unquote missile defense sites inside of continental Europe. Now, do you think that the return of Vladimir Putin to the leadership of Russia is going to increase tensions between the two nations?
I don't think so. I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin. I go there often on business as a student, as a tourist. And in terms of the burgeoning middle class now forming, particularly in the urban areas, I have a good friend who's a member of, who's a bourgeois, for lack of a better expression, who's part of a Facebook team of 400 people, professionals, and they had their own poll. Not a single person voted for Putin. Only 20% of the Moscow voting public voted for Putin. It's really a division between the urban elites and the rural, whatever you want to call them. But Russia's national interest will be whatever it is, whether it's Putin, Medvedev, or some of the people who ran against them. Their national interests are going to be the same. The difference is going to be the internal politics, which will definitely deteriorate under Putin unless he takes the message that the urban elites have deserted them. There was a poll taken when I was last there, last summer, and by some academic institute. 80% of the Russian leadership, however you define it, university graduates, political, military leaders, 80% either are starting the process or are seriously thinking of emigrating. So the entire intellectual elite is preparing to leave the country.
But if their national interests are, I mean, I assume what you're implying is that their natural interests are to have good relations with the United States as opposed to contradictory ones. But if that's the case, then why do we see Russia and the United States continually clashing, at least from an international basis, about what should be going on in terms of, intervention, sanctions?
I could talk for hours on this subject. I give certain lectures.
We've only got a half hour, so.
I understand. But let's just say after 1,000 years, the Russian people have yet to fundamentally decide whether they want us or not. And I think that really drives a lot of the conflict. But fundamentally, our interests are in peaceful relations, and I don't think either side has an interest in fomenting conflict. As a matter of fact, when I was there in 1993, right after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I had a friend whose father was a major general in the Red Army. It was right after the 91 Gulf War, and he said, you know, if we ever attacked the United States, we would have been toast.
A radiating ruin.
Well, let me ask you that. Speaking of that, let me ask you, Dr. Short. I know you have quite a bit of experience with certainly international conflict and travel and engaging in these issues. You know, do you think that American foreign policy, I mean, we're talking about missile defense, we're talking about, you know, potentially sanctions in Syria, has sort of an adventuristic element to it that, you know, is really more detrimental to the country than it is positive?
It depends on who in the country you're referring to. If we're looking at persons who have foreign interests or corporate interests abroad, what the U.S. is doing is perfect for them. If you're talking about the rank and file person who doesn't own any stock, who doesn't own any oil shares or futures, or doesn't speculate on grain harvest, it's Greek to them. So this is an example of why I think corporations should pay taxes, because that military machine that's funded, that guards their interests more so than that of the average American person, requires that Americans die, serve in military, families be divided by service, a whole lot of oil is used. All of that to maintain this military-industrial complex that doesn't necessarily pave streets or build schools or provide lunches. So I think for maybe the people who are in capital, they like that. I think the average American doesn't even understand that. They can't get beyond Beyonce and Snoop Dogg.
Mr. Wilson, let me ask you this, because you've worked in government, you have a lot of experience, particularly in the Reagan administration. You know, is the military-industrial complex what's really driving American policies abroad?
I don't think so. I think it's something we have to worry about because the military-industrial complex has a lot of influence on our Congress and on the administration in many cases. But until September 11, 2001, I think a lot of people thought, well, maybe we were overdoing this business of military preparedness. Maybe we didn't need all these armed forces. And indeed, we were cutting our defense spending for a long time before that. But now it becomes very clear that there are people in this world who want to cause death for Americans, simply because we're not like them, I think. And so we need the kind of military preparedness that we have today and will have in the future. We have to remain quite strong in order to deter these kinds of attacks, or after the attacks occur, to deal with the people who brought them about.
Well, Dr. Short, I saw you look a little skeptical there.
I don't think anybody wants to fight the United States. You just mentioned Russia has the second most powerful military in the world, and they don't want to be bothered with the United States because we've got them down. I don't think the Chinese want to fight the United States. I don't even think that most people who are classified as Muslim extremists want to fight the United States. What I think most people want to do is be left alone. But we have a system
Hold on. Wait a minute. Was there not an attack on the United States by a group of people from the Middle East?
As a son of the man who died in September of last year, my father was the first person in the Pentagon pulling people's bodies out. He died 2 days before 9/11, 9 years and 363 days into it. So I'm very much in tune with 9/11. What I want to say is there are a whole lot of things about that whole matter, like passports and so forth, that I don't even think we've really had a discussion, because we have a group of Americans who righteously, so I'm not saying you're not right, righteously say, if you mess with us, we're going to come get you. My only concern is, have we seen all of the evidence to understand exactly all of what happened? We know from the Nixon administration, we also know from the Kennedy administration, we know from Bill Clinton, that sometimes people in power give us their share of the story without sharing all of it for particular reasons, possibly national security. in the case of Bill Clinton, to cover up for what he was doing with Monica Lewinsky. So I'm not completely buying that, because bin Laden was a CIA asset. The bin Laden family has some investment with, what's that group? I'm forgetting, Carlyle Group, which the Bushes are in. There's a whole lot of strange things that happen with money and war and defense. And when money's on the table, I am a Christian. I studied to be a minister at Harvard. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. There's a lot of money that's been made since 9/11 by private contractors, by Raytheon, by Grumman. So I'm looking, cui bono, who benefited from this? I don't think that the Afghanis that are getting raided at night benefited. I don't think the Iraqis who are still going through benefited. So I'm curious.
Well, Mr. Brooks, please go ahead, Mr. Wells.
Well, I just want to say that if bin Laden was a CIA asset, that's going to be a big surprise to a lot of people in the Middle East when this gets broadcast there. I don't think that's true. The SEALs didn't go in and kill a CIA asset. So I think that
if the SEALs killed him, there's.
If you have any evidence, if you have any evidence to the contrary, I think.
But we do know certainly that bin Laden was part of this buildup of whatever you want to call jihadists, whatever you want to call them, inside of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Yeah. So doesn't the U.S. bear some responsibility there? For creating a broader organization, giving them the funding to build up their network.
Charlie Swore, the congressman from Texas.
Yes,
Charlie Wilson, I have the DVD, not that that's definitive, but I love it. I love the video. I've seen it about 10 times. If any of that is in any way truthful, that there was some point where someone in the Central Intelligence Agency said, let's beat those Rusky jackasses. Let's show them a lesson. Let's give them a Vietnam. I think I've read somewhere that was what some people wanted, and it happened, and someone got those guys weapons somehow with the ISI in Pakistan. There's some relationship somewhere. That's something that we don't have the time to debate, but I'm willing to go home and email you and send you some pretty credible sources that there was some involvement with our intelligence agencies and that war that crushed and beat the Russians in Afghanistan.
There isn't any question that our intelligence agencies were involved there. And there isn't any question that Osama bin Laden was one of the jihadists who was fighting in Afghanistan at the time. But obviously, he turned. After the Russians were driven out, he used Afghanistan as a base for fomenting an attack on the United States, which killed 3,000 people.
I didn't say he didn't turn, but the asset. No, I didn't deny. I said at one point there's some relationship. We can, and I'm not driven by ideology. I don't like bin Laden. I might have a beard, but that's not. He's not somebody that I'm trying to follow. But at some point, we've had this happen. It's called blowback, where we back somebody we say we want to get rid of somebody, and we back them, and then they come back and they bite us like a pit bull on the back.
Yep, that can happen.
And that's sort of also where, if we send people abroad and do things in terms of intelligence, one of my buddies is a CIA agent for many years, Luttrell Osborne, and we talk about this, that sometimes the kind of policy is thought out in short terms and not long terms, that if this guy was a crazy on the Russians, he could have been crazy on us after he got what he wanted. Because thank you and I appreciate you isn't always in the vocabulary of the people that we end up linking up with.
Well, Mr. Brooks, let me pose this to you, because we talked a little bit in a totally different context about what's best for the American people, and what we've seen is significant majorities of individuals against the war in Afghanistan, even 50% of Republicans. And so, to what degree have the American people, seemingly, at least what I am interpreting the poll numbers to say, are seem to be saying that what's going on in the Middle East, this U.S. policy, this idea of blowback is something that we shouldn't be pursuing. We shouldn't be around the world nation building. I mean, what's the disconnect between the two major parties who seem to want to increase war and the American people who seem to feel that pulling back is what's best for them?
Well, I mean, there is a disconnect. And I will give a disclaimer. I'm not a foreign policy expert. That's not what I work on a regular basis and my organization works on. But there is a sentiment amongst the American people that there's a tremendous amount of money being spent around the world on various conflicts. When we were in Iraq, billions of dollars a day. And when the American people are feeling the economic crisis that's happening within their own borders right now, they feel that there's other options for that money to be spent. And so what I think most Americans want a smarter foreign policy in a way that, one, people want to feel safe, right? Whether we create that as a mythical piece, a mythical thing, and create some type of enemy, or if it's real or not, people just want to feel safe. So there's that piece of it, but also people want to make sure that that money is being spent wisely. There was a lot of waste, whether you were for or against any of the wars. There was a lot of waste. There was a lot of Halliburton getting no big contracts. There was a lot of that going into that process, and I think that left a nasty taste, along with people within their families losing their lives overseas in places that they can't even pronounce, they don't even know, that most of the folks can't even point to on a map. They probably can now after CNN and all the other news stations have covered it as much as they have. So people want a smarter investment in the military-industrial complex. I mean, they feel that it's such a robust piece of our economy. It's having a negative impact on their ability to be prosperous, as we've talked about before, within America. And so making smarter decisions about that is incredibly important.
Well, Mr. Malashevich, let me ask you this on sort of a similar note, and I think we've alluded to this a little bit. I mean, we mentioned the military-industrial complex in a particular sense, but, to what degree, I mean, we know that the anti-war movement in America raised the slogan in Iraq, no blood for oil. I mean, to what degree is the military campaigns, I mean, whether it's the sanctions against Syria, against Iran, attempting to limit the power of China, to what extent is U.S. military action dictated by, an attempt to, I don't want to say necessarily manipulate markets, but certainly keep the world economy open for American corporations' benefits? I mean, is there something to that critique?
I think there's something. I think it's very little. I think we're in the position, and I'm an optimist, so I'm not intending to draw the analogy too far, but I recently read an interesting history of the military decline of the Roman Empire. And the basic thrust is that the empire decided to split the legions into smaller, more mobile units because the number of incidents had expanded so rapidly. And what I read in the papers is that we're doing the same thing, trying to put out more fires with the same number of people by increasing their mobility, and that's fine. But what I think we need to do, and I'm not suggesting we are in decline. I really don't. We have serious problems. I don't think we're in decline. I think we have to choose our fires more carefully. And that seems not. We have 100 soldiers now in Central Africa finding a guy who's no threat to the United States. We have folks in Somalia. We have folks in Yemen. Well,
Dr. Short, are we putting out fires, or are we maybe setting some more?
I have my questions about Thomas Coney. He's less of a problem than the dictator of the country that he's creating mayhem in. Museveni came to power with child soldiers. He's one of America's best allies. I mean, he's stolen 3 elections, so we've got 100 troops running after one crazy man, and then you have a crazy man who's doing genocide on his own people that we're funding. So we have 2 nuts. You have mixed nuts in Uganda. I mean, it's ridiculous to me. It seems like for all the money that they give some of these folks, hey, dictator, if you mess over your own people, you know what? We're going to find a jackal for you. Stop doing it. Fix up your country. Trade fairly with people. And if you do have someone like Coney that's a real idiot that you can't manage, provided you're being decent towards your own people, we'll give you some technical training, let them go to the School of the Americas or wherever and learn how to fight. But why should our young people be there and come back damaged from having to raid a house and perhaps shoot a mother or kid because they're trying to find a madman. Then they come back damaged and hurt people here. Not one American life is worth being destroyed, whether it's psychologically or wholly, totally, fighting something that's really not our issue.
Mr. Brooks.
And the other thing is, I think that we have to really figure out whether our conflicts or our engagement externally is about justice or is about economic interests, and being very transparent about that. And quite honestly, there's going to be economic interests, but how that plays out and how the American people support that becomes part of that dialogue that has to happen. I mean, if there is a social justice context or a justice context to conflict, whether we're saying, hey, they can't, we're the most powerful country in the world. We have to come in and fix this situation because it can't be fixed. We can't stand by and watch, babies die and folks die. And so American folks and our hearts are bleeding, and we need to go out and support folks. And that's one type of conflict. Now, if the conflict is about, hey, we have some economic interests on the ground, and if we can control different variables, no matter who those players are part of that conversation, then it becomes a more complicated dialogue that we have to have about our engagement and the amount of money that we spend.
Mr. Wilson, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in here, but I guess I wonder, maybe what is the moral basis for the United States? I mean, I think that's sort of the other piece of that is, does the United States have any real role to?
I think the United States, if you think about what we did in World War II, for example, that would be the kind of war that I think most Americans agree was the right kind of war. What we did in Tunisia just very recently, leading from behind, as the president called it, but at least getting the support of the international community for throwing out a dictator. Now we have the same kind of problem in Syria. The president has not decided yet what he wants to do. But hasn't the United States supported
Ben Ali, Mubarak? I mean, they're still supporting Bahrain. I mean, if it's about
the United States does not have completely clean hands here because we're a country that has to have support in the world. So we support people who probably we wouldn't necessarily want to support. But the reason we went into Tunisia, and the reason I think we'll ultimately go into Syria, is because the American people want us to do that. There will be demands for us to do that because of the terrible things that they see on television are happening in those countries.
There are two issues. One, Libya, which was supporting America in its war on terror. And then we have people, according to our own reports, no, you can run from it, but there's a document that was done, WikiLeaks had, it's called Down and Dirty in Derna, where people from the U.S. were looking at ways to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, even though he was supporting America's efforts against al-Qaeda. And then we turn around, we have that. And you have racial pogroms and murder going on right now. I was in Libya twice last year. I think some of my friends have been killed. To me, folks who didn't hate the United States, didn't want to fight the United States, had gotten rid of their weapons of mass destruction if they had them, and that society is now in an uproar. So you have fighting in Mali, fighting in Niger, fighting in Algeria. And in the case of Syria, I think that some of these weapons, they just got a ship. The ship was captured by the Lebanese authorities where weapons were coming from Libya to Syria. So who's doing the fighting? Not that I like the Assads. The name almost is how they are. This AS, they put one more, you'd almost get what they were. They need to go. But if you blow up a society where they're killing Christians...
But says who do they need to go? I mean, I think some people would argue that, compared to what? I mean, if there's a civil war inside of the country...
But I'm not talking about a civil war.
Is that an improvement of the nature of the people?
I think that their own society, the mass majority of the people, may be prepared to vote for someone else, but they don't want a violent thing like what they saw in Libya and Syria, because if you understand that Syria is a creation of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, you've got the Alawi, you've got the Shia. If you create a society like what they've done with Libya, where now everyone's killing each other, you're going to have a bloodbath in Syria. It will be worse under whatever replaces the Assads, and if the people are able to come together and use a democratic process to pick the leadership, and if they decide to vote for the Assads again, we've had 2 Bushes, we may have 2 Clintons, then let them do that.
But isn't that what the Syrian government has offered? I mean, it seems like, what's the mechanism?
I didn't say that the people hadn't been offered that, but they had to be pressured. Not that I even wanted that system of pressure, don't get me wrong. I don't want any fighting anywhere. now that it's gotten to the point where they're willing to make reforms that the majority of the people are willing to support, and they've got the kind of pressure where they can have the society that they want without a whole lot of folk being killed, and you don't have Christian women being raped and killed and shot and so forth. I'm for the most peaceful process possible in the interest of the majority of the people.
Mr. Wallace.
Am I missing something? I mean, I don't see that the Syrian government has offered people anything other than repression.
Well, they did agree to the Kofi Annan
and a new constitution.
But of course that hasn't worked. I mean, there was supposed to be a stand down. There was supposed to be no conflict. And since then, if I understand what I've been seeing on the news, there have been plenty of people killed by the Syrian army.
And there are plenty of people who are killing and weapons being brought in from other countries. If this were happening in the United States and people were to criticize the United States government and yet there are gangs getting weapons from Canada and Mexico and Bermuda, people would say, hey, wait a minute. And so there's a whole lot of support for this Assad regime by the people who didn't necessarily like them. The same thing happened in Libya. The bombing and the attacks on Libya made people rally to Gaddafi. Even if they had issues with them, they didn't want to be bombed. They didn't want to be terrorized. I believe that the kind of process is happening in Syria where the masses of people will be able to influence the creation of the kind of government that they want.
The surrounding countries, with the exception of Iran, but Turkey, for example, which is another Islamic country, believes that Assad has been murdering his own people. The Security Council of the United Nations voted for a strong control or suppression of what Assad is doing, except for Russia and China.
They voted for the same sort of thing for Saddam Hussein. So the Security Council, it's very interesting, some of the things that they've backed. And again, that doesn't leave, if you ask me, economic and security prerogatives of those few nations that comprise the Security Council. It's almost a who's who of who's not black, brown, or yellow, minus China, one or two places that make decisions for the rest of the world.
Do you think, and also the entire Arab community, as I understand it, has tried to get Assad to leave?
You mean the Persian Gulf, the people who are all the monarchical people who mistreat their own women, can't drive a car, the ones who are supporting the genocide in Bahrain? There's some really interesting people. They're the same ones that put out the news.
If we're looking for people who have no blemishes whatsoever, that's one thing.
Since
we're
you
looking for
mentioned
people who have an
blemishes,
interest.
Theologically, if you're sinless, cast a stone. These are very, very, very discombobulated societies in and of themselves that are deciding that another society should be more fair, more democratic, and yet they are none of those things.
Well, let me get Mr.
themselves.
Malashevitz in here before we run out of time.
I'm just going to be not a contrarian, but have a third view, as it were. Going back to my analogy to the Roman Empire and picking our fires more carefully. I frankly think in the case of Syria, the United States has nothing to do with what's going on there, and I think we should let them fight it out. And I think that's true in most of these other conflicts. Internal events, just like our Civil War. I just think what would have happened if England had recognized the Confederacy.
It would have been a mess.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you mentioned the Romans, I thought about where it was the Romans really got into trouble. They went into Bactria, or the Parthians, which is modern-day Iran. I mean, maybe we should leave Iran alone. Maybe those people, we should leave them alone.
Is ignore them. What they're looking for is publicity. They're looking to snooker the United States, and we're giving it to them all the time. I would say, if I were president, I would say nothing about Iran. I would ignore him.
And they snookered Carter. They snookered Reagan.
Yeah.
Some places you leave alone. There's some streets when you live in the hood that you don't go down.
Let me put it to you like this.
Knuckleheads.
Well, Mr. Wallace, and I want to bring this back to you. I mean, there's one place that the United States is leaving totally alone, which is Bahrain. And I see what you're saying. I mean, maybe the United States is. I guess my question for you is if, the United States should be supporting whatever they call quote-unquote democracy movements. I mean, why in Bahrain, where there's a strong democracy movement that's been brutally crushed, is the United States not using this opportunity to step in and say, this is not in our interest?
I believe that where democracy is developing, the United States ought to be helping. I think we did a little bit of that in Egypt, which it's turning out to be very difficult for the Egyptians to actually get a government in place. That's understandable. As democracies begin, it's very hard for them to compose all their differences in the way that we have over time learned to do. And we're going to have the same problem in Iraq. They're also having these same kinds of difficulties.
But what about
Bahrain? I think
what role can the United States play?
We should do something wherever there is a democratic movement that is being suppressed by the government. If we are supporting the government, we should be talking to that government. We might not necessarily want to intervene militarily, but we should be talking to that government about human rights. We were doing that in China. I don't know what the outcome of that will ultimately be, but whenever an American president or a secretary of state goes to one of these countries, we talk to them about human rights, and in some cases we impose sanctions of some kind if we think that they are treating their own populations very badly. I was saying before that the American people actually feel very strongly about the injustices that they see going on in the rest of the world, and they see it on television, and they move their government to do things in this area. That's why I happen to think that we will probably end up doing something in Syria because of what people are seeing on their televisions and what kind of support the opposition has gotten throughout the Middle East.
But there also needs to be, I don't totally disagree with that, but I do think there needs to be some translation for the American people, because most folks don't really understand the conflicts and the natures of those conflicts, what's behind it, what's our history in being engaged in those conflicts, whether it's be militarily or economically. And so I think there needs to be an education process of the American people to make sure that we're on the right side of those conflicts when we're intervening and making strategic decisions about what's important and in the best interest of the people in this country, not just economic interests, but for the people of this country. That's dollars that we spend in taxes that are sending, there's bodies that we're sending. And that's also our reputation, because some of the conflicts that we're engaged in are based on our reputation around the world. And we're in the process of trying to mend reputations where people look at us as undermining their ability to have, self-sustaining government. Whether it's democracy or something else, we all want to see a democratic system and a fair system. But also, we've taken steps historically to undermine some of that based on some of our economic interests. So it's making sure that we're able to step back and get a clear picture of those controversies.
Dr. Short, what about Bahrain? Is this an example of that? I mean, should we sanction them? Should we remove the Fifth Fleet?
I think that there are a couple of things. The United States, they could make a call to the House of Saud and say, hey guys, let's do this differently. And it would stop just like that. The people nearly got control, and that's when the Saudis came in with American-manufactured weapons and began beating the people down. This could be done with a phone call. The people in Qatar and everywhere else wouldn't be pushing this without some sense that they had the support, and it prolongs the bloodshed. There'll be more rage against the United States. There'll be more folks who want to be suicide bombers to hurt our good people here, because there will be some sense of tying America to what their dictatorship or their monarchical dictators are doing to them. I think that America has had, since the end of the Second World War, a very, very schizophrenic approach towards democracy. You can have a democratically elected popular leader like Mossadegh in Iran, you get rid of him. You have someone like Patrice Lumumba, they may not have done it, but they did mind the guy being bumped off, whoever he was talking to. This keeps happening, and that means we have to send more soldiers and we have to do more because we don't think about long-term relationships that are economic, social, and beneficial
thank you, Dr.
to
Short,
both sides.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone here for joining us on the special election edition of 2 Half Hours. As always, that's going to wrap things up for us on the special election edition here. There's been a lot of discussion, quite a bit of debate here. Now we really would like to hear what you have to think, so feel free to send us your comments and suggestions to en@irinn.ir. With both President Obama and Mitt Romney bringing in large amounts of money, what role will corporate America play in this election? With unemployment claims down, is the economy really in a recovery? Will the ceasefire in Syria hold, and how will the candidates react? What will it take for third parties to break through into the mainstream? Join us next week on 2 Half Hours with a whole new panel as we discuss all these questions and more. Look into the crystal ball with me, Eugene Puryear, right here in Washington. Thank you. Till next time.